lovely library lions. Today I'm going to be filming part 2 of my every series I've ever read ranked. I have to film it again because my computer had an internal error with the hard drive, so I lost the first filming, but that's okay. It was pretty fun to film, so I'm happy to do it again. And let's get right into it. We are right back here on tiermaker.com. So I will put an annotation to the first video if you haven't watched it, because I did rank all these books already, so the books that are already in my ranker, and let's just get started. So the first book that we have here is Mirage, which was an Owl Crate book, and I felt like the plot wasn't very unique, so I'm not going to be continuing reading it in the future. King of Scars, I just finished Rule of Wolves, and it was pretty good. It was pretty good, but it's not as good as Six of Crows. It's just a little beneath hitting the point where Six of Crows hit, so pretty tasty food, not the best around. Ace of Shades, I do want to read the sequel someday. It was an Owl Crate book and I kind of liked it. I like card games, but I'm not in a rush, obviously, since I'm pretty sure the third book is out and I haven't even read the sequel yet. Tith, I actively hated. I don't know why the second book is in this trilogy. It should just be a duology with book 1 and 3. The second book is an entirely different story, and it didn't feel like it really factored into the main plot or anything like that. Heart of Iron, I dropped on the first book, and I actually really hated it, which is weird, because it's written by Ashley Poston, and I really like her contemporary series, which we'll talk about in a bit. So I'm kind of sad that I hated it, but maybe it's just because it was science fiction. Wicked Saints, I dropped on the first book, and I have no intention of continuing to read that series. A, because I thought it was a pretty bad book, and I didn't like it, and B, because the author has been alleged to be certain things. I don't want to claim anything, but I just have no interest in continuing that series or reading anything by that author at the moment. We Hunt the Flame, dropped on the first book. I didn't feel like the romance was believable. I thought it felt really forced, and that sort of brought the whole book down for me. And I Darken, I'm not going to keep reading. I really thought it was well written. Historical fantasy just isn't for me. I love Kirsten White's writing otherwise. I love some of her other series, just not for me. Ninth House, I need the sequel. I'll buy the sequel the second it comes out. I need to know what's going to happen to Alex next. I love Leigh Bardugo and everything she writes, obviously. All her series are ranking pretty high. But Ninth House is very good, and maybe one of the best adult releases that I've ever read. The Rule of One, I'm not going to pick up the sequel. There were two main characters, and they both sounded the exact same to me. Shadow of the Fox, I am not going to pick up the sequel for that either. I don't really like Julie Kagawa's writing. I don't think she's an author who I can enjoy. I didn't like Talon, and I don't like Shadow of the Fox. I just find her writing to be really clunky. This Savage Song is adequate. I liked it a lot when I read it, but the ending sort of brought it down, and I don't remember a lot of it now. I feel like it's just all right. It was really strong in the first book, but the ending is just not an ending that stayed with me, and now I barely remember anything that happened in the entire series. But I thought it was fine. I had a fun time. The Gilded Wolves, dropped on the first book. I know it's terrible to say it, but I went in wanting another Six of Crows, and it was nothing like Six of Crows. If it had been something very different, I think maybe I would have enjoyed it, but it really did feel like the characters and the heist were all a little too similar to Six of Crows, while also not hitting as hard. Like, there were a lot of things where I saw parallels, and I don't know if that's just because it was a heist book and I'm not capable of seeing several books in the same genre, but I didn't really enjoy it. Harry Potter is a classic. I have loved it since I started to read. It's obviously going to go in the best around. If I read it now, I don't think I would put it there. It's there through mainly nostalgia power. I don't think it would get there now if I read it as an adult for the first time. The Untold Tale, I don't remember a lot about. It was a very fanfiction-y story to me. It was fun to read, but it was about a girl who gets pulled into a story where she has a crush on a character, and she's very powerful and useful in this universe, and her character that she loves falls in love with her, and, you know, like, I like that trope, but it wasn't with characters that I really cared for, so. Seraphina, I adored. I didn't read the sequel yet, but I did read a novella, so I'm going to count it as me being partially through the series, and I'm going to put it in Pretty Tasty Food. This is how dragons should be written if you're going to have them also kind of be human-like. I adored how Serafina used dragons and their sort of human bodies in the way that I didn't feel like Talon really held up to, which I talked about in my previous video. I felt like Talon did Serafina, but not the way that I wanted to personally see it. But maybe other people enjoyed Talon more than Serafina. It's all personal preference. Sky in the Deep. I read Sky in the Deep and then its companion novel, and I thought they were fine. I really liked the Viking world, but the characters I felt weren't very powerful, and it was mostly the world building that I thought was really cool. Unwind is going to go into Pretty Tasty Food. I love Neil Shusterman. I feel like he writes great speculative fiction, and I adored Unwind. It was one of the books that I really got back into reading with when I started my blog in 2015, I think. Trial by Fire, I have no interest in picking up the second book. The main character is just a pretty girl whose power is to boost the powers of all the hot boys around her, and everyone is in love with her, and I'm not invested at all. Incendiary, I will read the sequel someday. It was an Owl Crate book. I liked the influence that it had. I really liked the prince and the characters, and I liked how dark it was for a young adult novel. I felt like it skewed very dark for young adult. The Hazelwood, I'll read the sequel someday. I actually already own the sequel, and I think it's on my TBR for summer, maybe, I'm planning. So I might get to read that quite soon. I like stories with, like, storybook inspiration, and I think that I will like The Hazelwood. It just didn't sort of grab me so hard that I wanted to read it right away. Follow Me Back, I got an e-arc for, and I remember almost nothing about it, so I probably will not be reading the sequel for that. Bumped is a dystopian story that I really like the premise of. The writing, not so much, but the premise is really strong, so I do want to read the sequel. Amber and Dusk, I will read the sequel because I really like Sunder, and that's pretty much the only reason. Divergent, by book 3 or 4. There are 4 books. There are 4 books. The 4th book is 4. That counts. So by the 3rd book, I hated it. I hated what they were doing with Triss. I hated the very standard dystopian story, and I hated the ending. The ending I thought was very lame. Where Dreams Descend, I'll read the sequel someday because I really like magic, but I'm not clamoring for it. The Hunger Games is going to go inadequate. I feel like the first 2 books were strong, and the 3rd book wasn't very strong, and A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was horrible. I hated that book. Fullmetal Alchemist, best around. Best manga ever written, one of the best stories ever told. I will keep trying to force everyone to enjoy Fullmetal Alchemist as much as I do. A Curse So Dark and Lonely, I will read the sequel someday. I liked it. I liked that it had a disabled protagonist, and I like Beauty and the Beast retellings. I thought this was fairly unique. I really want to see more of Grey. Shadow and Bone is good. It's pretty tasty food. It's not as good as Six of Crows, which is what all of the Grishaverse books are going to be held up against. But I did like it. I didn't really ship Alina with anyone, so I didn't get super into it. Black Butler is pretty tasty food. The art is amazing. The fan service is next level. I'm still reading it, and it makes me sad that it only comes out once a month. That hurts my heart. Grace and Fury, I will read the sequel eventually. When I started it, I wasn't super into it, but the sort of twist on the characters' personalities really intrigued me. And I do want to see more of where these characters are going to go and who they're going to become. Caraval is pretty tasty food. I love the world. I love the magic that they set up. It wouldn't be in Pretty Tasty Food if they hadn't introduced Jax, because I love him. I am so excited for Once Upon a Broken Heart, and that's why Caraval gets to be here instead of just in the adequate category. Legendborn, I need the sequel. Please tell us anything about the sequel. Tell us the title, give us a cover drop, tell us a blurb, anything. I'm desperate for news about the sequel. I really want it to come out this year, because if it doesn't, I'm going to cry. I need to see what's going to happen to Bree and to Selwyn, and like a little to Nick. I don't care about him that much. Ouran High School Host Club is unenjoyable. I loved the anime when I was in high school, and you know what? It just doesn't hold up. And the manga especially has like a very awkward early 2000s art style that I'm not a fan of. Miss Peregrine's, I dropped on the first book. I was kind of hoping for like a creepypasta sort of story with the creepy, spooky children. and like photos of the kids and stuff, and that was not what it was. It was just like a super power story almost with creepy photos in it. The Guinevere Deception, I will read the sequel someday. I actually own the sequel and I think it's on my summer TBR, so I should be getting to that soon. One of Kirsten White's books that I really, really love. Fire and Blood, I need the sequel immediately. I think George R. R. Martin's writing style lends so much better to a fake textbook, or like a fake history textbook, than it did to the high fantasy that he's writing in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think this is better than A Song of Ice and Fire, if I'm being honest. I really love the Targaryens, plus there are more dragons, so what's not to like? The Looking Glass Wars, I dropped on the first book because I borrowed it from a friend in high school and I couldn't find the sequel anywhere at the time, and I'm not super invested in finding it now. Diary of a Wimpy Kid is adequate. It's a good kid's book. It gets pretty repetitive after you've read a couple of them because the stories are pretty much the same, and Greg doesn't ever really become a good person or a better person, but you know, kids' books are repetitive and it's interesting. I still enjoy them when I read them. Scavenge the Stars, I will read the sequel someday. It's an Owl Crate book and I like pirate-themed books, so I enjoyed this. Fair enough to read the sequel. The Cruel Prince goes right up to the best around. My favorite book series by Holly Black. I love Cardan, I love Jude, I love the darkness of the Fae realm. I love how Holly Black writes fairies in general. I think she has a really good sort of sense for classic Fae superstitions, and her fairies are very rooted in those superstitions, which I really loved. Bonecryer's Moon, I'll read the sequel someday, almost exclusively because of how pretty the covers are. The story inside is fine. I didn't super fall for it, but the covers are pretty enough that I'm gonna give the sequel a chance. My Hero Academia is adequate. The recent arcs have been plummeting in quality. It had a really strong point and now it is not at that strong point anymore. So I'm not enjoying it as much as I once was. The Ruin of Kings, I will read the sequel. I own the sequel and I want to get my hands on the third book. I think there are going to be 5 in total, but it is good. I really like fantasy books with footnotes, and that is what this is. Goddess in the Machine, I dropped on the first book. I don't think I'm going to continue with Goddess in the Machine. I just don't have an interest in it. Yeah, it's a science fiction story, and it's not the type of science fiction that I want to be reading. Shine is, I need the sequel. I thought it was such a beautiful look at both the good part of K-pop and also the dark parts of the industry that often get glossed over by K-pop fiction, where it's all about a fan meeting a K-pop star and falling in love. This is a very good look into the industry by someone who was in the industry and who was maybe not treated the best by it. So I thought it was really fascinating to read, and I really want to see how she ends up ending her story. Crescent City, I need the sequel as soon as it comes out. We haven't heard anything about it yet, which disappoints me, but I think it's really maybe Moss's best work. I love the relationship between Bryce and Danica. I think that's such a strong friendship, and I love that it's the core of the series instead of a romance. I really want to see more of this world. I like that it's sort of urban while still having magical qualities. Just so good compared to Court of Silver Flames, which really disappointed me only recently. The Sons of Thestian is pretty tasty food. I don't think it gets as much recognition as it should. It's a pretty good series. I like the way that it handles Faye, and I really love some of the characters. It's very well written. I Hate Everyone But You is going to go into forgettable or unenjoyable. It was fine until the sequel. As a standalone, great. The sequel gets really convoluted and the characters become very unlikable. It's like they learned nothing in the first book. I don't think it needed a sequel. It should have been a standalone. Hush Hush I read in elementary school, and I'm not gonna read the sequel. It's been so long. I think I liked it all right. I don't think I was super in love. I don't think it was book boyfriend quality, so I'm not gonna finish it. Fruits Basket, pretty tasty food. So it's not the best manga I've ever read, but it has really solid characters, and I love the story. I am so enjoying the new season, so season 3 of the Fruits Basket remake. It is so good. I adore Yuki. Yuki is my everything. The Lightning Thief, I will read the sequel eventually. I'm not rushing to get to it. I'll probably borrow it from someone. I like it. I see why it's so popular, but I didn't read it when I was young, so I don't have that nostalgia value for it, but I do want to read more of it. Daughter of the Pirate King, pretty tasty food. It's a duology. I think it had a very strong, tight story. It knew what it wanted to accomplish, and it did that. It had huge Pirates of the Caribbean vibes, which I loved. And I think Alosa is just such a great female character, and I love that her whole pirate crew is just strong female characters. Crown of Feathers, I think is forgettable or unenjoyable. It was such a good debut book. The first book was amazing, and then the sequel was just... I felt like the sequel brought it down as a series, and I didn't want to keep reading it. I'm so disappointed that that's how it went, but I loved the first book, and the sequel was just not for me. Geekerella is going to go right up to the best around. It's the only contemporary series that's going to go there. I love this series so much. It features conventions, fandom, blogging, all sorts of things that I'm really into. I feel like Ashley Poston really understood what it meant to be at a convention, how it felt to be at a convention. She's the author who's described it the best, and they're one of my favorite places to be, so I really like seeing them in fiction, and I thought, you know, she's really got that understanding of fandom, so I really love these books. Renegades is adequate. It was fine. I thought it had a good premise, and I didn't really like the ending. I thought it was only okay. Could have gone so many ways differently that I would have thought were way better, but it was fine. It was enjoyable while it lasted. Alana, The First Adventures. This is the Song of the Lioness. Adequate. Song of the Lioness has been good so far, but I've only read the first 2 books in it, and in the first 2 books, Alana's very young. It's very middle grade fiction. It's good middle grade fiction, but it's very middle grade fiction. I want to see more of Alana as an adult and see where her character goes. Maybe it'll get up to pretty tasty food, maybe it won't. The Princess Saves Herself in this one I thought was unenjoyable. I thought the first book of poems was really good, and the second book was just... I don't feel like it should have had a second book, to be honest. I didn't really enjoy that at all. I loved the first book so much, though. It breaks my heart to put it in there, because the second book isn't bad. I just didn't feel like they connected very well. Maybe I'm just stupid. Maybe I don't understand poetry. Duff, I dropped on the first book. I hated this. I hate girls who aren't like other girls, and I hated how Beatrice looked down on her friends when she was really just an awful person who no one wanted to be around for very valid reasons. Strange the Dreamer, I bought the sequel, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm really desperate to read it. It's just so big, I need time where I can sit down and properly give it my attention. Rebel Rose, I will read the sequel someday. The next book is going to be Mulan, and I like that Disney has given each princess a different author, and they've chosen a Chinese-American author to write Mulan. I think that's great that they're giving the princesses proper representation and letting people who, you know, understand the princesses better give them a voice. I'm really excited to see what happens in the Mulan book. I think it's called Feather and Flame. It's coming out this year. Scythe, would have been in I'll read the sequel someday, but my best friend convinced me that it needs to be read sooner, so I bought both the sequels, and I'm going to be getting onto those as soon as I can. Warcross, I just read Wildcard, and it's hovering in between these two. I feel like Wildcard got rid of everything that made Warcross enjoyable. Like, Warcross was about this beautiful digital world, and then in Wildcard you almost see none of it. I think it still goes inadequate. I think it's still an alright read, but I didn't love it. I loved Warcross, and I didn't love Wildcard. Smoke and Bone, I bought the sequel as soon as I finished the first one. I'm going to read it as soon as I can. I think Laini Taylor is just such an amazing author. She has such good world building and magic systems, and I can't wait to see what happens to Kaoru. If I Stay, I dropped on the first book, just because it was fine. It was just fine. I didn't really feel any attachment to it. I don't really care about it, but it wasn't bad. It's not for me. Girls of Paper and Fire is right now in unenjoyable because I thought the sequel was so bad. The characters feel like they regress. It's just a long journey book where there's nothing but traveling and miscommunication, which I thought was super boring. It was really strong when it was a political thriller about these two girls trying to survive as concubines in the emperor's service, and then this second book was just two girls walking through the snow for a lot of pages. But I'll read the third book and maybe it'll bump it up. All the Stars and Teeth, I will read the sequel someday. I liked it. It had some pirate characters, which I enjoyed. I loved the healer character. I thought his power was so cool and he was such a neat character, so I'm going to read the sequel. I just don't know when. Delirium, I'm going to do Matched and Delirium together. So I read these when I was really into dystopian. I thought dystopian was the biggest thing, and I cannot tell you anything about Matched and Delirium. They are both very standard 2000s dystopian, and they blend together, and I'm not going to be reading the sequels for either of them. Crier's War, I don't know why I'm starting from the back now, but Crier's War, I will read the sequel eventually. That's getting really hard to say. Will read the sequel eventually. I loved that it was a sapphic romance and that the struggle was between them being human and android, not that they were both women. And I thought the world was pretty neat, so I'm gonna give that a read. I also really love the covers. This one is like a beautiful metallic silver, and I think the sequel is a metallic gold, so I am gonna definitely read the sequel when I have a chance. Eon goes into Adequate. It was a good story. I really liked it. It was a snappy duology. It was a fast read. And I liked the 12 dragons and how they were laid out. But, I didn't really fall in love with any of the characters too much. Spin the Dawn. I have the sequel and I'm going to read it. I just don't know when. I really like competition-based books, and I loved that this one focused on embroidery. I think that's such a neat competition to have your book focused on, because the stakes were very high, but also it was an embroidery competition, so you just read a lot of pages of beautiful sewing descriptions. Queen of Hearts is the last one, and it is adequate. I liked Dinah as the Queen of Hearts. I liked how they told her story, and she was a villain, but she also was the protagonist, and you could see why she was doing some of these evil things. I thought that was neat. I really liked the Wonderland that Colleen Oakes created, and I did enjoy it. I didn't think it was an amazing book, but I thought it was a pretty good book. So that is all of the series that I've ever read. We have a couple here in the best around. These ones I would recommend to anyone. I think they're super enjoyable. Anyone can enjoy them. Pretty tasty food. Pretty good. No reason not to give any of these a try. Adequate. If you like the genre they're in, you'll probably enjoy them, but they're not going to be sort of the best ones that you've read in that genre. Forgettable and Unenjoyable, I don't really recommend these series, but they're fine. Actively Hated, I loathe these series. I hate where these series went. I think they were such waste of potential. These are probably the books where I am most excited for the sequels for the next year or two. And then books where I am partway through the series and I'm going to finish the series in a few years, probably. And then the biggest group is dropped on the first book, because it's really easy to read one book and then decide that you're not going to keep going. So that is my biggest group. There's more than I thought there was going to be, and there's also less than I thought there was going to be, but I think it's pretty neat to see all the series that I've ever read laid out like this. So that is it for this video. I hope that all of you have a lovely weekend, and I hope that I can see you here again next week.